Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another bonus episode, the second half of our conversation with scholar Ben Kiernan. In this half of the conversation, we talk with Ben about the logic behind the Khmer Rouge policies, the way to understand the political nature of their government, and his work calculating the death toll, the human cost of their time in power. Let's take people, pretending we don't know what happens next, let's take people to 1975, spring of 75. Khmer Rouge win the Cambodian Civil War, roll into Phnom Penh. What did the Khmer Rouge view as the most pressing order of business now that they had won the war and, of course, taken control of the country? There's been, famine-like conditions looming. There's obviously been bombing. What could have, in the post-war situation, at least help understand their policies? And then when did they sort of just break off from reality? Was it right away? Were there attempts to do, sensible things that evolved into the extremist program they developed? What was that moment like when they inherited Cambodia?
Well, I think as soon as they took power, they attempted two different and possibly concurrent but difficult to implement, maybe contradictory policy. Firstly, a massive rearrangement of the economy, evacuation and emptying of all the cities of Cambodia, ending urban production and deploying the labour force of the cities into the countryside to develop rice production and focusing totally on rice production. And so this was a massive rearrangement of the revolutionary rearrangement of the economy. This was obviously traumatic for the urban population. Wasn't easy for the rural population either to support the urban population while the rice crop was being planted and there was little food in the countryside yet before the harvest to support the dependent urban population which had been transferred to the rural areas and needed to be fed. So there was a burden being imposed on the rural population as well. Nevertheless, the ideology of the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot was to see the urban evacuees as deportees, as second-class citizens, as what they were called, what was it now? There was a hierarchy where there was a new people and the base people. The base people were the rural population who lived in the Khmer Rouge areas during the war, and the new people, or deportees, were the people from the city. And the other policy, which was in some ways exacerbating the difficulties, was immediately to start raiding and seizing territory from Vietnam. Of course, the Cambodian War ended 2 weeks before the Vietnam War, April 17th, and it wasn't until April 30th that the Vietnamese communists took Saigon. But immediately after April 17th, Khmer Rouge troops, having won the war against the Lon Nol regime, started attacking into South Vietnam, which was still for a couple of weeks controlled by the old Thieu regime, South Vietnamese Republic of Vietnam, and seizing islands off the coast of South Vietnam that were South Vietnamese territory, and murdering people there, killing 500 people on Phu Quoc Island, and seizing it. And it wasn't until the North Vietnamese army completed its victory over Thieu regime, Republic of Vietnam, that it was able to then turn its attention to evicting Khmer Rouge invaders from Phu Quoc Island parts of the South Vietnamese territory that the Khmer Rouge had taken. So the Khmer Rouge had immediately, they won their war in Cambodia, had sent troops to the border to South Vietnam and started a war there, which they quickly lost. But it did detract from their economic reorganization efforts, and made it even more difficult for the population of Cambodia to recover from the war.
There's lots of different observations about how the Khmer Rouge deviated from, even the most radical Maoist traditions of the time. I mean, you were just talking about the peasantification, emptying the cities and all of that. Normally when you have a communist revolution, the emphasis is on, taking industry wherever it is and beefing it up at the expense of the rural population to industrialize and get through some level of industrialization. The Khmer Rouge obviously opted to turn the country into, a giant and fairly low tech, backward agricultural workhouse. How did they sort of justify this in their Marxist-Leninist terms at the time?
Well, I think we need to look at the components of the ideology of the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot. And I think there are a number of different elements which made up this amalgam of Khmer Rouge ideology. There was Stalinism. Pol Pot had been a member of the French Communist Party, which at that time, late 40s and early 50s, was in its Stalinist heyday. And there was, this is where I think Pol Pot got his absolute authoritarian domination ideas, from the Stalinist history of the French Communist Party at the time that he was associated with. There's also the Maoist contribution to the ideology of the Khmer Rouge. There is the way, as you mentioned, the rural focus, or if not a rural obsession. It's reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution to some extent, sending people out from the cities into the countryside to learn from the peasants and so on. Was the ideology of the Cultural Revolution under Mao. But of course, the cities were never empty in the Cultural Revolution or at any stage. There was also the Great Leap Forward, developing rural industries in China under Mao in the late 50s and early 60s, a massive failure where 30 million or more people died. Pol Pot wanted to emulate that, but he wanted to go further. He wanted to have a super great leap forward, a super great leap forward. He wanted to outdo Maoism. So it's not just following Maoism, it's doing better than Maoism. And here we get to the third element of the Khmer Rouge ideology, which I think is possibly appropriately titled the national chauvinism. So he's learning from Maoism, but he wants to outdo it. There's nothing particularly communism about wanting to be the best possible, the most extreme possible communist. And that boils down to the racist ideology, the national chauvinist ideology of the Khmer Rouge. The idea that Pol Pot called himself when he was in Paris, his pseudonym, name that he signed, at least one of his articles, Khmer Dam, the original Cambodian. It's looking backwards to the past. It's focusing on the ethnicity of being Khmer Dam. And it's all about the special race of Cambodians. And this bled over into ethnic animosity towards Vietnamese, towards charms, which I emphasize again was even more racist than Lon Nol, who tried to include the Chams in his racist spectrum. And not only that, but like Lon Nol, he wanted to and tried much harder, Pol Pot, to take over lost territories from centuries before, including the Mekong Delta. As I mentioned, one of the first things the Khmer Rouge did when they took power was attack the Mekong Delta and the islands offshore of belonging to South Vietnam. They also attacked, getting ahead of myself here, but in 1977, in a second wave of attacks, they attacked again to the Mekong Delta, all along the border of Cambodia and Vietnam, at many points. And also, at the same time, the Thai-Cambodian border, because there were territories in Thailand where Cambodian is spoken. And back in the medieval days, or late, early modern days, those territories were taken from Cambodia by Thailand, and Pol Pot wanted to retake them. Even Laos, Khieu Samphan, head of state of Pol Pot's regime, said that the territories where there are sugar palms belong to Cambodia, right up to somewhere in central Laos. And there were clashes with Laos as well, all beginning December 1976, at the same time as the attacks were about to begin on Vietnam and Thailand. And so this idea of national chauvinism, along with Stalinism and Maoism, but in both of those communist cases, the ideology had to be outdone in the interest of Cambodian superiority, in the interest of national racism.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue. Oh, sorry.
I just had, as a kind of corollary question to one that we asked sort of near the beginning about what made, the emergence of Khmer nationalism different from the other kinds of nationalisms of that time. Although I think Brendan and I are sort of generally loath to do comparative evaluations, so directly at least, I am curious, after, that answer, leaving together, very different, in global currents, ideological currents of that time. Are there any other, whether totally contemporaneous or a few years after, or are there other examples of, if not communist movements like Khmer Rouge, but, like groups that are able to take over a state or assume power of a state, and then are able to try to affect via policy to try and put into effect, this kind of, I guess, national chauvinism, as you described it. Is this, not like totally unique, but is there a uniqueness to this, or are there other examples you think that are sort of worth identifying that are similar?
Well, Nazism comes to mind, as a parallel case. There is not an ideological connection that you can see between the Pol Pot regime or the Khmer Rouge leaders and Nazism, but there are some comparative elements that those two regimes share. There's also racism in some other Southeast Asian political formations. But I think another question worth asking is, in other Cambodian political formations, unlike the Khmer Rouge, there was a live and let live viewpoint, even with the Lon Nol regime and its attitude towards including the Chams. Even though it committed genocide against the ethnic Vietnamese in 1970, it didn't take the same attitude towards the Chams, which the Khmer Rouge did. It was quite possible, even given Cambodia's late development of a modern education system, which is down to the French, and their tardiness and lack of development of Cambodia's education system in the colonial period. even given Cambodia's special lack of a colonial education system compared to Burma and I would say also Thailand, which wasn't colonized, developed its education system. Even given that trans-Cambodian phenomenon, there were still plenty of Cambodians who didn't share the racism that Pol Pot exhibited, that Yang Sari exhibited. There were plenty of Cambodians, for instance, who wanted to be neutral in relation to his neighbours and not to get involved in wars with other countries. Pol Pot was the opposite. So Sihanouk, and to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, Bon Non. But compared to them, Pol Pot was an extremist. So it wasn't anything to do with Cambodian culture or even its history, which was different from other countries. That explains Pol Pot's policies. It's Pol Pot's own ideology and determination, his own decision-making that explains, along with those of his allies like Yang Sari and Mok, his military commander, and so on. These people made their decisions. These decisions were not determined by Cambodia's history because lots of other Cambodians made different decisions and got killed for it, like Hu Yun, for instance, in 1975, who spoke out again and again against the cruelty of Pol Pot's policies and got moved by Pol Pot.
You mentioned the French colonial aspect, the legacy, and how they would redraw the borders, pretty liberally throughout their time in power, often at the expense of Cambodia. To what degree was that legacy affecting the border conflicts initiated by the Khmer Rouge in the 70s, which of course led up to their war with Vietnam? How much of these border issues were sort of a knock-on effect from that colonial period?
Well, I think the did recover the territory that Thailand had seized, including Angkor, which the Thais seized during World War II. Angkor, Siem Reap, and Battambang. They recovered the territory, those provinces which Thailand had seized, and Thailand seized them again in World War II, but Cambodia got them back again. So I don't think the French can be blamed for giving up Cambodian territory to Thailand. I think the way Pol Pot looked at it was, well, we got this territory back, but we need to get even more back. And I think he saw territory which had been seized by Thailand in the 1500s, such as the Rin province, where Cambodian is spoken, where the population is Khmer speaking, that has been in Thai hands for hundreds of years. It seems quite clear that the Khmer Rouge regime sponsored an insurgency in Thailand to break those provinces from Thailand and bring them into Cambodia. An insurgency called Angkar Siam, the Siamese Angkar being the Cambodian communist leadership in Siam. So this was an insurgency within Thailand that was sponsored by the Khmer Rouge regime. And not to speak of the attacks on Thailand by the Khmer Rouge army into Prachinburi province, next door to the Surin province. So it's very clear that Pol Pot wasn't happy with the French regaining Siem Reap and Battambang provinces. He wanted more from Thailand.
So obviously one of the central questions, and you've done a lot of work on this, what is the estimated death toll of the years of democratic Kampuchea? And if you could, break it down for our listeners to understand how much of it was, if you like, due to mismanagement that could cause things like famine, how much was due to intentionally brutal policies or lethal policies, or then also not intentionally lethal policies necessarily, like overwork of the population, which could kill people but wasn't necessarily designed to kill them. And then how much, was due to outright active mass executions and the like.
Right. I think you need to make a distinction between a kind of demographic assessment of what the population would have been at the end of the Khmer Rouge regime if they hadn't ruled for 3 years and 9 months or whatever it was, and what it is. For instance, demographers might argue, that there would have been a certain death rate anyway amongst the elderly population. A number of those would have died in that 3 to 4 year period. So that would have naturally happened, and therefore you can't take that population who would have died anyway as a death toll under the Khmer Rouge. However, if you're looking at it from a legal point of view rather than a demographic point of view, if somebody who is, say, 95 years old is murdered, that is the responsibility of the perpetrator. They might have died in the next year or two anyway, but that's not relevant from a legal point of view. So I just wanted to clear that up. Demographically, that death might have occurred, but the reason it occurred was because they were murdered. They were shot to death or overworked or died of starvation. The cause of their death was not natural. If that's the case, well, then the death toll has to be counted as at the hands of the perpetrators rather than a natural demographic decline. So we need to distinguish between those two kinds of deaths. Right. There are other distinctions to be made as well, which you made. Some deaths were caused by the evacuation of the cities, people being kicked out of the cities. I believe about 20,000 people died on those marches, on those forced marches out of the cities. The population of about 2 million people of Phnom Penh, about 20,000 people died in the next few weeks as they were being forced out. They weren't able to bring enough food with them, or there were pregnant women and they died giving birth on the way. Many, many people died. 20,000 is my estimate for that. So you can say that wasn't intentional, that the Khmer Rouge weren't deliberately setting out to kill those 20,000 people, but certainly it's the responsibility of their decision to empty the cities without sparing even the hospital patients. We know the hospitals were evacuated, and the patients were expelled from the cities as well. So they contributed to the hospital patients who died on the way were part of the 20,000 death toll, just from the evacuation of the cities. About in the early 80s or so, I think, I came up with a figure for the total death toll in the Khmer Rouge period of 1.5 million. I can't remember, it was a few years later, I raised that to 1.7 million. Out of a population of 7.9 or nearly 8 million was the population of Cambodia when the Khmer Rouge took power. So it was about 21% in my estimate of the population died in 3 years and I think it's 9 months between April 1975 and January 1979. So that's about a fifth of Cambodia's 1975 population. died in less than 4 years following. Now, a lot of them were murdered by execution, outright massacre. A number, as you mentioned, were worked to death. A number died of starvation. The group demographic expert report was commissioned by the UN-sponsored tribunal. Eva Tabo and Trey Kiem, a European and a Cambodian expert, worked together on producing a demographic expert report for the tribunal, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia that was set up by the UN, made up of Cambodian judges and UN appointed judges. And these two demographic experts concluded that actual killings amounted to about 1 million in the Khmer Rouge period. So more than half of the 1.7 million were actual killings. I think that these demographic experts have come up with an accurate figure, and they also concluded that my figure of 1.7 million is an accurate minimum figure for the total death toll.
Mm-hmm.
But they gave a figure themselves for the number of actual killings, quote unquote, quote, actual killings, unquote, of about 1 million. So for instance, in the eastern zone of Cambodia, from May 1978 until the end of the regime in January 1979, when the central government of the Pol Pot regime attacked that whole zone and massacred large numbers of people, the zone population, I think, was about 1.5 million, according to the statistics of 1976, the regime statistics. And they murdered a lot of people on the spot and forcibly evacuated a number of hundreds of thousands of people from the eastern zone to the northwest and massacred them there in large numbers. My estimate is that about 250,000 of the eastern zone population were killed in that operation alone, which is just in the last 6 or 8 months of the Pol Pot regime. So that contributes about a quarter of the actual killings that are accounted for by the demographic experts report.
So to what extent, now that we're in the late 70s, the Khmer Rouge is in power, they're carrying out these atrocities, to what extent were their crimes known about at that point? To Vietnam, which was going from an ally to an enemy, formally speaking, to China, which was at that point their patron, and for that matter, the United States, which was pretty soon to switch over to the Khmer Rouge side. You know, to what degree were these crimes known about?
Right. Well, Vietnam first. One of the first things that the Khmer Rouge did was expel most of the remaining ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia. As I mentioned earlier, about half of them had fled the Lon Nol regime's 1970 mass murders or genocide, as the French embassy concluded in 1970, and fled to South Vietnam. Some of them came back later, in the later years of the Lon Nol regime. But when the Khmer Rouge took over in 1975 and 76, they expelled about 150,000 ethnic Vietnamese, who were most of the remaining. About 20,000 ethnic Vietnamese were all that was left in Cambodia after 1976. So about 150,000 were expelled in 75 and 76. those people were expelled to Vietnam. Some of them were murdered along the way, but up to 150,000 ended up being expelled in South Vietnam under the communist regime, which had taken power at the end of April 1975. So they would have informed the new communist regime in Vietnam what was happening in Cambodia, mostly in the last few months, but in 75 and 76, at least, the Vietnamese communist regime would have known what was happening in Cambodia then. They were also negotiating Cambodia because the Cambodian Pol Pot regime had, as I mentioned, attacked the islands offshore and so on and taken over Vietnamese territory, which they'd then been expelled from. So there were negotiations. And in 76, in May of 76, I believe, and then again in June of 77, and again in 78, in February 1978, the Vietnamese called for negotiations. In all three cases, the Cambodian government, Pol Pot, refused to sit down and negotiate the border conflict that was started by the Pol Pot regime. So there was a Vietnamese embassy in Phnom Penh, Vietnamese Communist Embassy, until December of 77. But then it was expelled in the last day of December 77 when the Pol Pot regime broke off diplomatic relations with Vietnam after twice refusing to sit down and negotiate. As proposed by the Vietnamese. And then in February 78, the Vietnamese proposed negotiations again and a mutual pullback from the border, 5 kilometres on both sides, and a de-escalation of the conflict. But the Khmer Rouge regime refused that, which led to the Vietnamese making preparations to invade and overthrow the Pol Pot regime. They saw no other way to end to their border. For China, I'm not sure that the Chinese encouraged the Cambodians to attack Vietnam. They certainly armed them massively, but I'm not sure that they incited the Vietnamese. But when the Vietnamese did turn and overthrow the Pol Pot regime, then China invaded North Vietnam, and 200,000 Chinese troops poured across the border into North Vietnam in an attempt to prevent the Vietnamese from consolidating their overthrow of the Pol Pot regime. So China was a massive supporter of the Pol Pot regime. It was possibly not an inciter of its aggression, but it made possible that aggression by arming the Cambodian government with tanks, naval craft, and I believe even submarines were provided by, according to my memory, even submarines were provided by the Chinese to the Khmer Rouge. The United States, I think, sorry, just to finish the question, I can't remember exactly when it was that President Jimmy Carter of the United States made this statement, but I think he said in 1978 something like, the Pol Pot regime is the world's worst violator of human rights.
Yeah.
Well, it's good. Good that he said that, because it would be really embarrassing if America went on to support the Pol Pot clique in the coming years as part of their geopolitical chess game of Vietnam.
Yes, which...
I think Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, had a slightly different emphasis. He made a statement which I think is quoted by Elizabeth Becker in her book. He said things like, Pol Pot was an abomination. We couldn't support him, but China could. And I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. And I
Indeed.
think he said, I encouraged Thailand to support Pol Pot, which they did. And they were a major US ally.
That's certainly a factor in our show in the second half, is what we'll be focusing on. I just want to move to the last question because it's, in a way, the most sort of nitty-gritty legal or conceptual area, and I'm curious about your thoughts. We've laid it out for our listeners, the definition of the crime of genocide, to destroy people in whole or in part, an ethnic or national or religious group. Can you give us a survey of the answers of whether or not that matches the actions of the Pol Pot regime? You know, crimes against humanity are not in doubt. The scale of the killings are not in doubt. But you have some people who have argued over the years, or have written a lot about Cambodia, that the crime of genocide is racial in intention, and that the Khmer Rouge, maybe in their argument, is actually just executing people out of political motivation. And then what's the difference there between fellow Khmers, who the Khmer Rouge, probably pretty certainly didn't want to eliminate as a race, but whom they still killed in large numbers, and the ethnic minorities? Obviously they now stand convicted of pursuing genocidal policies towards.
Well, the legal definition of genocide is acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such. And the acts include killing members of the group or imposing conditions of life calculated to destroy the group in whole or in part, and other such acts, including forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. But there are 5 different kinds of acts. Nominate 3 of them. Now, acts committed with the intent to destroy an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group in whole or in part, as such, makes it clear, according to the lawyers who interpret the Genocide Convention of 1948, to which Cambodia was a signatory, they make it clear that this requires conscious desire on the part of the perpetrator to destroy the group. And this has been... So the UN-sponsored tribunal found the Khmer Rouge surviving leaders, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, guilty of genocide against the ethnic Vietnamese minority, the 20,000 of them who were still alive after 1976 in Cambodia. Only about a dozen of them survived. They were nearly all murdered in 77 and 78. And this was a clear case of genocide, the acts committed with the intent to destroy an ethnic group in whole or in part, in this case nearly in whole as such. They also found Nguyen Chia guilty, again in 2018, of genocide of the Cham Muslim minority, an ethnic or religious group, and many more Chams survived than ethnic Vietnamese, but still a large number of Chams were murdered in the Khmer Rouge regime. I think the numbers are about 40%. In my estimate, I think it was 37%, and another scholar of genocide came up with a figure of 41% of the Chams were murdered in Cambodia under Khmer Rouge. Now, what the tribunal didn't investigate in much detail or conclude was the genocide was a religious group, that is the Buddhist monkhood, which was the largest religious group in Cambodia. Many Buddhist monasteries existed all over Cambodia with dozens of monks in each one. And they were, they were all defrocked. They were forced to cast off their Buddhist monkhood robes and were for a while allowed to exist along with the general population before being murdered sometime later. Now, some have suggested that because they were merely defrocked and then only later murdered, this didn't constitute genocide because they weren't murdered while they were still Buddhist monks. But the fact that they were defrocked and then murdered and selected for murder in larger proportions, much larger proportions than those of the general population. And we know this from surveys of the Buddhist monkhoods by interviewing surviving Buddhist monks, telling of the small numbers of their monastery populations who were not murdered, who survived. We know that the Buddhist monks, even after they were defrocked, even though they were defrocked first, were still killed or died in huge proportions compared to the population generally. And so it's clear that they were selected, that they were targeted as a religious group, as such. However, the tribunal didn't consider this case for close investigation. I think they only looked at one district of Cambodia, of 100 districts, if my memory is correct, where they looked at the possible genocide of the Buddhist monk. But it's clear from other surveys that scholars such as Chantu Bua and others have carried out, that the number and proportion of Buddhist monks who perished in the Pol Pot period was a very high percentage, and that there was a deliberate attempt to destroy a religious group as such, in whole or in part. And that's another case of genocide. Now, I could mention others such as the ethnic Chinese, which I have written about, where about half the population of ethnic Chinese perished in the Pol Pot period. But I won't go into that now. I will go into the general population of Khmers, the majority population. Now, as I mentioned, the Genocide Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group as such. And the acts include killing members of the group. And as I mentioned, actual killings extended to about 1 million people of the Cambodian population as a whole, including Buddhist monks, including Chinese, including Chams and Vietnamese. But most of the killings were directed at members of the Khmer majority, an ethnic, national, racial or religious group. That's a national group, the Khmer majority. In whole or in part of a national group were subjected to massive killings. Now, the tribunal didn't find this to be a genocide. It did find it to be extermination. In the first case that they concluded in 2014, they found the Khmer Rouge surviving leaders, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, guilty of the crime against humanity of extermination, which is a different definition, and it applies to political groups as well as ethnic, national, racial, or religious groups. It doesn't require the high burden of proof that genocide does require, but it's still an extremely serious crime against extermination. It's not just murder, which is another crime against humanity. It's extermination as a crime against humanity. And the Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan were both found guilty of that. in relation to the Khmer majority. Now, that was a judgment made by the tribunal, but it's close enough to genocide, along with the two cases of genocide, which the tribunal concluded 4 years later, to make it quite appropriate to see extermination and genocide side by side as part of a single process, even though they're legally distinct, but still legally close crime.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. Your work has been an essential part of putting together this season, and it was a pleasure to do this interview. Thank you.
All right, good talking to you.